Okay, everybody, we are a couple minutes now past the half hour, so I think it's a great time to go ahead and dive into our content here today. One last call to let us know where you're joining from before we move on out of the lobby space. I see a really great diversity of people here today, all the way from the East Coast, though it looks like we haven't gotten anybody up too far in New England. Nobody looks like above Pennsylvania, maybe, at least the way it's showing up on my map right now yet. And a little bit sparse once we get west of the Rockies, but definitely a few callers from out there. Thanks to everybody for doing that. If you haven't yet and you want to let us know where you're joining from, you want to let us know that New England is in the house, you can do that by using the Zoom function to the top right of the map that you see in the center of the screen, and then grabbing the little purple flag that you see to the top left and dragging and dropping it onto the map. Thank you again for doing that. It's always great to see where people are joining from. And okay, I think I saw someone just pop up. It looks like maybe in New Hampshire or Vermont. A little bit hard to tell on my screen, but I'm glad we got that part of the country held down. Thanks very much for doing that, Dee. You can also let us know what program you represent using the survey down at the bottom of the screen. Looks like we've got a pretty good distribution here today. Mostly FGP, but with a fair bit of SCP as well, and even some RSVP programs. This webinar itself is largely geared toward the foster grandparent and senior companion programs, but we know that many of you have multiple programs, and of course you're always welcome. We do have a very similar webinar planned tomorrow for the RSVP grantee. So if you're an RSVP grantee, come on back tomorrow and we'll be talking about your specific national performance measure requirements because they are a little bit different. Okay, let's go ahead and get started and dive into our content here today. We are here to talk about the National Performance Measure requirements for foster grandparent and senior companion renewals. In particular, we're focusing on foster grandparent and senior companion projects who are renewing their 3-year grants on April 1st, 2018. And we really like to emphasize that word renewal to distinguish it from a continuation. As many of you may be aware, a renewal is when you go from one 3-year project period to another. A continuation is when you go from one budget period to another. That's just 1 year, that one budget year to another. That's a continuation. When you go into a renewal, you have more flexibility, you have more options, and it's a nice window to really look back and say, hey, what have I been doing? What have I achieved? And what do I need to do to set myself up for further success? And we'll really be drilling down deep into that flexibility here today. You can follow along with the invitation to apply, which is available on the Managing Senior Corps Grants page for your specific program. I'm going to copy and paste that into the chat box so you have that link. My guess is that a fair number of you who are here with us today actually joined us last week when we spent a whole webinar really focusing on that invitation to apply, digging deep within it. Tamika, my colleague, pointed out some areas of it that we should be particularly aware of, and that recording is coming out soon. If you missed that and you want that information, stay tuned because we'll be sharing that recording very soon. All lines are on mute, so if you're trying to speak and we can't hear you, that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be. That's just generally how we have the best experience for everyone. You can ask questions, and we encourage you to ask questions using the webinar Q&A box over to the bottom left of your screen. And in fact, to get us warmed up and ready to ask questions, I'm going to ask everyone else a question and invite you to put your answer there in that Q&A box. Go ahead and let us know your name, your program, and where you're joining us from in that Q&A box. We already saw it on the map. We saw people click those boxes, and that gives us a good picture, but it's nice to let people sort of introduce themselves, if you will, using that chat box, and it also just gives us a chance to try it out, see how it works. So go ahead and fill that up. Thanks, Triste, for getting us started out there in Dallas. Thanks, Whitney in Arkansas, for keeping it going, and we'll watch those as they populate. So thanks, everybody, for saying hello using that little chat space. That's how you'll be asking questions here today. This call is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can disconnect at any time. And that is it for our housekeeping notes. We're going to talk about 4 things here today. We're going to do a quick little refresher on national performance measures in general. And then we're going to spend a lot of time, really the focus of this webinar is going to be digging deep into the national performance measure requirements that you'll see in the FGP and SCP invitations to apply. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about new performance measures, and finally we'll actually look inside eGrants to give you a sense of what you can expect when you go to enter your work plans there. Let's kick it off with the National Performance Measure Refresher. When we talk about national performance measures, we really like to distinguish between three key terms: national performance measures, your performance measure requirements, and your performance measure instructions. National performance measures are the uniform measures that allow us to aggregate and communicate national services impact all across the country. So as I look at our chat box here right now, I see that we've got Patty from Terre Haute, Indiana, and we've got Fran from Honolulu, Hawaii. This allows us to take the impact of those two programs and add it up and say, hey, here's what the foster grandparent or senior companion programs are doing all across the country, or here's what all of our senior companion program, or sorry, all of our senior core programs, I meant to say, are doing all across the country. Because they're the same measures that are actually used by our colleagues in RSVP. In fact, they're very similar and actually largely the same to what our colleagues are using throughout the national service community in our sister programs at AmeriCorps Vista and AmeriCorps State and National. And that allows us to tell a really powerful story. The ability to add up your impact is really powerful when we talk to our constituents in Congress, who are representatives of all of you, again, representatives of the American people, and then when we talk directly to the American people to paint the picture of what you all are achieving. Of course, to be able to do that, to be able to add up that impact and paint a unified picture of national services impact, we need to have a little bit of standardization. You've got to compare apples to apples. And that's why we've got this set of national performance measures, this uniform set of national performance measures, standard outputs and outcomes that are used across all of national service. But the national performance measure requirements are where things start to get a little bit more tailored to your specific programs. These set certain benchmarks for how all of our grantees are programming volunteers, and they do vary by program. That's why I said at the beginning that if you do work with an RSVP program, you should know that the content today is going to be a little bit different than what actually applies to you, because a foster grandparent program that's placing exclusively volunteers in schools, as an example, to work with young people, will need to have a little bit of a different model than a senior companion program that's having older Americans go out and serving other older Americans in the community. And that'll need to have a slightly different model than an RSVP program that's delivering meals throughout an entire community, right? We know programs are different. And the performance measure requirements allow us to set a certain minimum standard that all of our programs can reach, but it's a different minimum standard for each program. And we'll talk about a lot of that today. Finally, the performance measure instructions are the document that contains the specific measures for each program and their instructions for use. It's kind of where the performance measures meet the requirements. And each program has its own set of performance measure instructions. So if you go to the Managing Senior Corps Grants page, the link that I shared earlier in the chat box, and follow that, you'll see what's called Appendix B, because it's Appendix B to the invitation to apply. And those are your performance measure instructions. They're the menu of available performance measures. And they actually tell you how to use each one. They tell you when to measure, how to measure. They might suggest instruments, or at least tell you what would make a good instrument depending on the measure. So those are three different terms that can sound kind of confusing and sound kind of similar, but it's important to keep them all a little bit separate. Where you interact with your performance measures most of all, at this stage anyway, is when you're putting together your work plan. And your work plan is really just a way of reflecting the logical relationships between these four categories in that greenish color: the community need, the service activity, the output, and the outcome, right? When we ask you to complete a work plan, we're asking you to help us connect those logical dots. We're asking you to help us see what the need in your communities that you're serving, how the service activities that you're using address that need, and then looking ahead, what outputs and outcomes we can expect from that. There's a technical term that's often used for this logical connection, and I'd be very curious if anyone can let me know what I'm thinking of in the chat box. Another technical term that you'll hear used from time to time to describe this logical connection that we see in the work plans. I wonder if anyone knows what term I'm thinking of. Logic model. Yeah, logic model. We usually use a slightly different term called theory of change, but they're very similar ideas, right? Logic model and theory of change are very similar ideas. They're both saying, okay, what is the logic, thus that term, thanks Melanie, behind the program? What is the theory behind that program? How am I connecting all of these things? And that's what we're asking you to do when you fill out your work plan. And then we're asking you to go measure, to connect it back to the performance measurements, measure how you're doing and how close you're getting to the goals that you set. Now you'll see that the outcome box is dotted on the screen, and that's because not all work plans will have outcomes. Not all work plans will have outcomes. And that's something that we'll come back to a little bit later on. And of course, when we do ask you to fill out your work plans, we ask you to give us a little bit more information on each of these boxes. The service activity description, some information about your instrument, about the instruments that you're using, and we'll come back to these. But right now, really focus on that connection between the top 4 things. As I've said before, you can find more information on the Managing Senior Corps Grants page. There's a little screenshot of it there on the screen right now, and if we have time at the end, we'll go back and look at it in some more depth and spotlight some specific tools. This is a really quick refresher of national performance measures. There's also a lot of great information on this in Litmus, our online learning system, including a whole curriculum on performance measurements. If you want more information, you can, of course, always ask your program officer, and then maybe even go into Litmus and take some other courses. But let's start by focusing on these national performance measure requirements. Now, as you see on the screen, we started these in 2016, which means that actually a lot of your colleagues have already gone through this transition. Those of you who joined us for our webinar last week when we were talking about the invitation to apply will be familiar with this, right? We started a couple years ago transitioning to this system, and the way we do that transition is we have basically a third of our portfolio go through it every year for 3 years. You guys are the last in line to do that, which means that you've got a lot of colleagues who've actually gone through this transition and might have some insight for you as you navigate your own way. The big headline change is that we've updated our requirements to move away from that old percentage-based system, what used to be known as the EGG, and we've replaced it with a minimum number of VSYs that must meet a certain set of requirements, a certain set of criteria. And we'll spend more time talking about what those criteria are. There are also new service activities and measures. But really the headline that we're going to focus on is what we've replaced that percentage-based system with, that flat rate of VSYs per dollar amount, that flat rate of VSYs per dollar amount, because that's the biggest change. What you'll see on your screen right now is a summary, a paraphrasing, if you will, of what's in the invitation to apply. And we really recommend that you go back and look at the invitation to apply to understand this in more depth. But let's sort of zoom out and try to get our heads around this. Again, some of this will be familiar to those of you who joined us last week. We're going to start by going over some of the ground we covered then, and then we're going to move a little bit farther, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper. So what do the invitations to apply say? Well, they say for every $6,000 in annual base federal funding, at least one volunteer service year worth of service must be placed in work plans that result in, for FGP programs, outcomes in the education focus area. For SCP programs, outcomes in the healthy futures area. That's what we would expect. And I should also add, for SCP, it's not just healthy futures, but it's the objective of aging in place. For both programs, we also have this option, if you've historically been working in this area, that you can include outputs in the inclusion of individuals with developmental disabilities. We're not looking to expand our work in that area, but if you have historically been working in that area, you can use an output in that particular area to count towards these outcomes. So we've got one piece of this, that rate, for every $6,000 in annual base federal funding, we need to program one volunteer service year in a certain way. And then we've got how we need to program it. For FGP, towards outcomes in education or outputs in development, in the inclusion of individuals with developmental disabilities. For SCP, it's in outcomes in healthy futures, aging in place, or again, in the inclusion of individuals with developmental disabilities for an output. From here on out, I'm going to refer to these types of work plans as outcome-based work plans. I think you guys can already tell, if I said all of this every time I was talking about one of these work plans, we would be here a very long time. So I'm going to use the shorthand outcome-based work plans for these types of work plans. For FGP work plans with outcomes in the education focus area or the inclusion of individuals with disabilities. SCP programs, outcomes in the healthy futures focus area, or again, outputs in the inclusion of individuals with disabilities. I'll be calling them outcome-based work plans for short, but do know that there is that one rather narrow area where outputs could actually be included in this. But just know from here on out, if I say outcome-based work plans, that's what I'm talking about, and connect it back to your specific program. So these are the requirements, but what you're probably wondering is, okay, what do I do with them? How do I get started? We've got a 3-step process for considering what to do under these new requirements. And as you'll see, I can't actually tell you exactly what to do. There's a lot of flexibility baked into the system. So you're going to have to make some decisions. You're going to have to look back and say, what's right for my community? What's right for my program? Where do I want to go from here? Probably you're going to want to talk to your program officer, see what they think, see what insight they have. But you are going to have some decisions to make. So we can map out the decision-making process, but we can't tell you exactly what to do. That's going to be largely up to you. So let's look at this process. Step 1, determine the number of VSYs that must be programmed in outcome-based work plans, those special work plans I just talked about. Step 2, program those VSYs. Step 3, if necessary, allocate your remaining VSYs among other work plans. We'll take these one at a time. Let's start by determining the number of VSYs that must be programmed in outcome-based work plans. There's a pretty simple formula you can do to figure that out, to figure out how many VSYs you need to program in this way. Take your total annual federal funding, that's your base federal funding, and divide it by $6,000. Take your total annual base federal funding and divide it by $6,000. That will give you the number of VSYs you need to program in this specific way. So let's do a quick example. So we've got, let's say we've got a sponsor with an annual base federal funding of $360,000, and they currently have 100 VSYs. So they've got an annual base federal funding of $360,000. They've currently got 100 VSYs, and the question we want to ask is, how many VSYs do they need to program in this specific way? And let's do a quick little exercise and see what you think. So how many VSYs must this program with $360,000 program in this specific way? I see some answers starting to come in. I'm going to give it just a minute to give more people a chance to answer. Okay, I see some people using the chat as well. We've got people in both the poll and the chat. I think you guys have caught on. You should now be able to see how everyone answered. 60, right? You guys are on track. $360,000 divided by $6,000 equals 60. 60 VSYs need to be programmed in this specific way. Fantastic. Okay. So we figured out how many VSYs need to be programmed in this specific way. Now we need to figure out what to do with them. $60 VSYs in these outcome-based work plans. And remember, what they do with them is if you're in the FGP program, you're programming them towards outcomes in education, outcome-based work plans in education. For SCP, you're programming them towards outcomes in healthy futures, and in particular, aging in place. And for both programs, if you've historically worked in that area, you could program them toward outputs for the inclusion of people with disabilities. So that's step 2. That's how you're programming them. Now, you've got a lot of options there in the FGP space, right? Those of you who've worked in FGP for a little while will know that you've actually got several different outcome measures. In SCP, it's more limited. You've got 2 outcome measures, one focused on clients, one focused on companions. And if you have been historically working for the inclusion of individuals with disabilities, you've got even another option that you can add to those potential areas. But that's what you're doing with this 60. With the 60. However, as you can see, we actually have a sponsor here that starts with 100 VSYs. So the question is, well, what happens now? What happens with those other VSYs? Well, they've got a choice. As I've said a few different times here, this new process that we've got is all about flexibility. You've got a choice. You can do one of two things. This sponsor could reduce the total number of VSYs to 60 and place them all in outcome-based work plans. They could reduce the number of VSYs to 60 and place them all in outcome-based work plans. Or they could retain all of their VSYs as long as they place at least 60 in outcome-based work plans. And actually, they can retain all of them or any number between 60 and 100. They could retain 99. They could retain 98. They could retain 97. I think you guys get the idea. The point is, in this situation, the sponsor has flexibility to determine the right number of VSYs for them. This is an opportunity to right-size a program. As long as you have at least that required number of VSYs, 60 for this example, programmed into outcome-based work plans, you have a lot of flexibility about what you can do with those additional VSYs. I see Daisy's asking if you'll receive a copy of the slides. Yes, a link to a copy of the slides will be provided along with the recording. Thanks for the question, Daisy. Right now, we've got lots of flexibility. So let's think about this a little bit more. We talked about determining the number of VSYs that must be programmed in outcome-based work plans. We've talked about how you could program those. But then if you retain all of them, you've actually got a choice again. If you retain more than that 60, you've got a choice again. If you retain more than that 60, you've got a choice again, because you can actually program them among other work plans. What could you program them towards? Well, you could program towards outcomes in other focus areas, assuming that they're in alignment with your program's allowable activities. You could program them into output-only work plans. Remember earlier when I said that not all work plans have an outcome? You can have output-only work plans. Or you could program them into this new performance measure that we have called other community priorities. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but the general idea is you all are too creative for any one standardized set of performance measures. And not everything that you do can be captured by that one set. So you've got this other community priorities option for really unique activities that aren't captured in those performance measures. And you can do all of that, if you want, with your other VSYs. I see Jillian's asked a question. Jillian's asked, aside from helping the community, what are the benefits to the sponsor to maintain their current level of VSYs? Well, there are a couple of different answers to that question. Obviously, you hit the first one on the head, which is helping the community, right? You've got those, you've possibly got volunteers who make up those additional VSYs, and you've got stations who are hoping for those VSYs. So that's probably the number one factor. And you can also imagine it from a relationship standpoint, not just a peer impact standpoint about how you're going to manage those relationships with stations. Doing things like changing your numbers of VSYs is hard. It's probably not something you want to do lightly because of how it can impact the rest of your program. We're also going to talk in a couple of minutes about how it can impact the direct benefit ratio, which is another way that it might be a little bit more difficult for some sponsors than others to reduce their number of VSYs. But in general, you do have the option, and the idea is not that more VSYs or less VSYs is necessarily what we are hoping for in any particular way. What we're hoping for is that a program gets to the VSY level that's right for them, that allows them to manage their volunteers effectively and have the greatest impact on the community while they do that. So it really is a choice. Okay, we're going to do a couple more examples and then I'll take some more questions. We're going to do a couple more examples and then I'm going to take some more questions. Let's go back to our polling screen and hang on just 1 minute while I pull up the next example for us. All right, let's do this example. Sponsor 1 receives $360,000 in federal funding and it currently has 100 VSYs. That sounds pretty familiar, right? Let's say it chooses to reduce its total number of VSYs to 60 and program them all into outcome-based work plans. If that's the case, is sponsor 1 meeting its requirements? If it reduces all of its VSYs to 60 and programming them all into outcome-based work plans, is it meeting its requirements? I see some answers coming in. I'm going to wait just another minute to give more people a chance to answer. $360,000 in federal funding, entering the process with 100 VSYs. She's reduced them to 60. Is it meeting its requirements? Okay, we've got a good number of answers here, so I'm going to go ahead and share the results that we've got. Most of you said yes, and that's the right answer, right? This is the exact example we were just looking at. Yes, in this situation, this sponsor is meeting its requirements. Even though it's reducing its number of VSYs, it has that option here as we've set up this example. Okay, let's go ahead and do another example. Okay, sponsor 2 also receives $360,000 and currently has 100 VSYs. Very similar example. It chooses to reduce its total number of VSYs to 80, not all the way down to 60, not keeping it 100, it's somewhere in between, to 80. It programs 60 into outcome-based work plans and 20 into output-only work plans. Does sponsor 2 meet its requirements? Does sponsor 2 meet its requirements? Coming in. I see some answers coming in, and I'm going to go ahead and release the results. Okay, I think everybody's tracking pretty well. Yes, in that situation, it does. In that situation, it does meet its requirements. Right? So you can go in between the number you enter with and that minimum number. Let's try another example. And they're going to just, oh wait, actually we're going to jump ahead and look at one example together next. Don't worry, the examples are going to get a little bit harder, but let's do one together again for a slightly different situation. So far, we've been looking at sponsors that have more VSYs than the minimum amount. But let's say we've got sponsor 3, currently receives $210,000 in annual base federal funding, and it currently has 30 VSYs. Let's see if we've got any math whizzes before I step on. How many VSYs would this sponsor need to program in these specific ways towards outcome-based work plans? Okay, I see a couple answers coming in. 35, right, 35. So it needs to program 35 in this specific way. Well, what does that mean? That's more than what they currently have. Well, this sponsor will need to increase its total number of VSYs to 35 and place them all in outcome-based work plans. This is a minimum standard. It allows us to say, hey, taxpayers out there, this is the minimum amount of impact, the minimum amount of volunteerism that you're getting for these dollars. So it is a minimum standard. The good news is we expect this to be relatively rare. We picked that $6,000 number knowing that most foster grandparent and senior companion programs are actually between $3,000 and $4,000 per VSY in outcome-based work plans right now. So we think it'll be rare, but certainly it may happen from time to time that there will be a grantee who needs to increase their total number of VSYs to 35. There's another piece of good news though, which is that work plans are based on your expected performance in year 3, which means that this sponsor, sponsor 3, has 3 years in which to accomplish this change. It is 3 years to phase this in. And by the way, that's actually true for all of you. That's just how CNCS reviews these work plans in general. We look at expected performance in year 3. So when you're setting up your goals and when you're imagining what the future of your program can be, look to meet this requirement in year 3 of your grant. And that's true whether you're going up in terms of your number of VSYs or down. In both cases, you have 3 years to phase that change in. Okay, a couple of logistical questions, and then I'm going to pause and take some questions. For projection purposes, assume 1 VSY equals 1 unduplicated volunteer. We're going to take a look in eGrants in just a minute, and one thing that you'll see is it doesn't actually ask you about VSYs when it asks you to complete your work plans. It asks you about unduplicated volunteers. And that's because the eGrant system was just coded a certain way, and we can't change it. So it's still asking you for unduplicated volunteers, but we're asking you for this process to assume 1 VSY equals 1 unduplicated volunteer. Just assume that. We know it's not always going to be true, but just assume that for this purpose. Next, and this is something I alluded to earlier, the direct benefit ratio still applies. For those of you who don't know the direct benefit ratio, it's also often called the 80-20 rule. It's a regulation that says that foster grandparent and senior companion programs need to spend an amount equivalent to at least 80% of their federal funding to the quote-unquote direct benefit of volunteers. And it further defines what that means. Stipends are included in that, recognition, reimbursements are included in that. But if you're going to be decreasing your number of VSYs while your total federal funding amount remains the same, if you're going to be decreasing your number of VSYs while your total federal funding amount remains the same, what else could change? What else could change? I'm wondering if anybody in the chat box there can let me know what I'm thinking of. If they are decreasing the amount they spend on VSYs, but the total federal funding amount stays the same. Does anyone have an idea what I'm thinking of? Well, if I'm spending less on VSYs, that means I'm spending less on stipends. Stipends are in that category of things that are claimed to be, or that are categorized as, probably is the best way to say it, direct benefits to the volunteer. So that means my direct benefit ratio is going to change, unless I make that up with other spending on those kinds of activities. So if you're right up on the edge of your direct benefit ratio right now, this might be less appealing an option to you than if you've got some flexibility there. Because if you're decreasing your number of VSYs, it's going to affect your direct benefit ratio unless you make some other changes. And that's why it's really critical to talk to your program officer about this. If this sounds interesting to you, if you're looking at your program and saying, hey, I really think I need to right-size my program, you got to be aware of how it touches all the other parts of what you do. And this is a really good example. You need to be very careful about that direct benefit ratio. So talk to your program officer about that and see what the possibilities are. We've only briefly alluded to your actual performance measures here, the actual outputs and outcomes that you can use. Those are, as I already mentioned, in Appendix B. And remember that your work plans are based on expected period after year 3, at the end of year 3. So that's what you should be keeping in mind as you program. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to walk through a couple more examples. Going to make it a little bit harder, but they are hopefully going to be a review, a chance for us to just review everything that we've gone through so far. So before we do that, I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions. You can use questions, or you can let me know if you have questions using that chat box. A couple people have already done that. Thank you for doing that. And it's the same place you've been putting in your answers to some of these questions. So I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any, which could be a good thing, or it could mean that I've been muted this whole time and nobody's here left in the webinar. Let's see if we have any questions to let me know that I'm coming through okay. I think I'm coming through okay, but I don't see any questions, so I won't belabor the point. If you do have any questions, we do have some more content here to go. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to put them into that chat box. You can do it at any time. You don't need to wait for me to pause. And thank you to those of you who've already done that and gotten us started. Okay, let's do a little recap here with a couple of examples. We're on to Sponsor 4. Sponsor 4 receives $180,000 in federal funding. How many VSYs must it program into outcome-based work plans? This is one we've done before. It's just setting up our next one. Sponsor 4 receives $180,000. I see some answers coming in. Okay, I think we've got it. 30, right? 180,000 divided by 6,000. That's the math. That's the simple part. Now let's go ahead and see what we think they can do about it. Let's see what we think they can do, or rather with it, not about it, with it. Suppose it currently has 40 VSYs. It needed to have 30, remember. We just established in our last question it needed to have 30. Suppose it has 40. Choose all of the options below that would be acceptable. It can maintain, and by the way, you can choose more than one answer here. Oh, apologies. I think there was a slight glitch there. Okay, let's go back to it. Thanks to Amanda, our webinar facilitator, for jumping in and getting that fixed. You should be able to choose multiple answers here now, and I think you can. Choose all of the acceptable options for this grantee. Can it maintain all 40 of its VSYs and program them all into outcome-based work plans? Can it maintain all 40 VSYs, program 30 into outcome-based work plans, and 10 into output-only work plans? Can it reduce its total number of VSYs to 30 and program them all into outcome-based work plans? Can it reduce its total number of VSYs to 25 and program them all into outcome-based work plans? I see a fair number of answers here before I go ahead and turn on the results, but I don't want to rush anybody. This is a little trickier. Choose all of the options that it can do. You don't need to choose just one, and I'll tell you, there is more than one correct answer up on the screen right now. Okay, going once, last chance to get your answers in. All right, let's see what people did. All right, this one was a little bit tricky. I told you they were going to get harder. The correct answer is everything but the last option. So you guys all did a great job by looking at that last option saying 25, less than 30. Can't do that. But all of the other three options are actually okay. So let's walk through them briefly. In the first one, they're actually programming more VSYs into outcome-based work plans. Well, remember, we're talking about a minimum threshold here, a minimum standard. By all means, if you've got the program to do it, if your volunteers are out there having a lot of success, if you've got the stations to do it, you've got a recruitment waiting list, by all means, you can keep extra VSYs and program them into outcome-based work plans. You don't need to shift them to other work plans. In fact, it might not even make sense to if you've only got, let's say, 1 or 2 work plans. You might not want to create a whole other work plan just for them. Of course, this is a similar example we've looked at before. It can have 30, it can have that minimum threshold in outcome-based work plans and program 10 into output-only work plans. Or it can reduce its total number of VSYs to 30 and program them all into outcome-based work plans, right? 30 was its minimum standard. 30 was that minimum standard. So it can reduce the number of VSYs it carries all the way down to that minimum standard, as long as it then programs them all into outcome-based work plans. As long as it then programs them all into outcome-based work plans. Okay, so that sums this portion all up. Let me pause again for questions because we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the new performance measures we have as we head into the back half of this webinar. Let me do another quick call for questions. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll forge ahead. Start by talking about some new performance measures that we have. There are new measures or service activities available in some areas, actually many areas, and we've already talked about this other new option called Other Community Priorities. Well, for the foster grandparent program, there's actually a lot of new activities there. There's an output for integrating individuals with disabilities. We've talked about that before, and that can actually count towards your outcome-based work plans. There are also outcomes for tutoring and mentoring related to post-secondary institutions. There are outputs for physical education and nutrition education. And there are also outputs for distributing healthcare information. We don't have time to go into all of those in depth here today, but do look at the performance measure instructions, Appendix B, where you can learn more about those. For the Senior Companion Program, because the service activities are a little bit more limited, the options are also a little bit more limited, but we do have that new output for integrating individuals with disabilities in their communities. And again, that counts towards your outcome-based work plan requirement. All programs have this option of other community priorities. You'll see this in both of your performance measure instructions, FGP and SCP. And it's really, really flexible. It's really, really open. The idea is, once again, that you are all doing really innovative, interesting stuff. And there should be a place to capture the activity that you do that doesn't align neatly with one of our performance measures. And that's what other community priorities is for. It's a real catch-all for those other activities that fall outside of our regular performance measures, and you can use it. Now, it doesn't count towards those outcome-based requirements because we do need that minimum amount of standardization, that minimum amount of organization, but if you have any VSYs beyond that, you can program them into other community priorities. The last thing that we're going to do before I pause for questions again is take a look inside eGrants. It might have been a while since you've all put in full work plans in eGrants, maybe 3 years, so let's take a peek inside. As a refresher, our work plans in eGrants have 4 major components: the community need, the service activity, the output, and the outcome, because they are trying to capture that theory of change or logic model that we talked about earlier, that logical connection among those 4 activities. In addition, we ask you for a little bit more information about each of those, and we're going to show you where you can find out exactly what we're asking for about each of those. So when you first go into the performance measure section of eGrants, you're going to see it looks like this. It's blank because you're going into a renewal. It won't have all of the work plans you're used to seeing there. You're going to have to create them. And you do that by clicking that big blue begin button, Once you do that, it'll take you to a page that looks like this. This is the FGP version, but the SCP version looks very similar, except with that healthy futures bar that you see in the middle of the screen becomes more important. When you click on those arrows, they will drop down. The objectives underneath each of the focus areas will drop down, and you can choose the ones that you're going to enter work plans for. Right? And then we see the Healthy Futures one that's more important for the Senior Companion Program. Now, next you'll get to this screen. It won't look like this right at first because what we're seeing at the top there are actually all of the work plans that have been entered so far. So as you enter work plans, that top portion will become more complete. But first you need to enter some of the information that you see below that where it says performance measures. You're going to choose a category and choose an objective, and then you're going to be providing that more information that we talked about, that more information beyond just those top line 4 boxes. Of course, we do still have those boxes there for you. We do still need to know about your community, but we're asking a little bit more too. The most important thing to know about these questions are that you should use the grant application instructions to fill them out. That's another resource on the Managing Senior Court Grants page where we tell you exactly what we're looking for a community needs statement. We tell you exactly what we're looking for an instrument description. Some people look at these boxes and say, oh, that's a kind of small box. I guess they don't really need a whole lot of information. And we don't need a whole lot of information, but we need some specific information. And the way you find that specific information is by using the grant application instructions. We tell you exactly what we're looking for in that box. And that's really important because it paints a picture to us, which we in turn then use to paint a picture for the American citizen about what their work is doing in all of your fantastic programs. So please do take the time to review your grant application instructions and fill these boxes out accordingly. Now, after you fill one out entirely, you'll see it populate back up in that top section. And then you'll be able to allocate your VSYs among all of the work plans. As I already mentioned, you'll notice it doesn't say VSY anywhere on the screen. What it says is, I'm going to go all the way over there, it says unduplicated volunteers. It says unduplicated volunteers. And when I mentioned that you're going to be assuming that one VSY equals one unduplicated volunteer, that's exactly what I was talking about. Of course, while you're filling this out, you're also going to need to propose output targets and outcome targets based on what you're hoping to achieve this year. But what's really important about this screen is you'll be putting your VSYs in this box, even though it says number of unduplicated volunteers, because you'll be assuming that one VSY is equivalent to one unduplicated volunteer. If you do that, it'll add them up for you in this box up here. You'll see it also asks you for the number of volunteers contributing, because you may have some volunteers who are working on more than one work plan, and the number of stations involved in that particular activity. What's really important is that that box up there to the left, that will count up the number of unduplicated volunteers you put here, which is equivalent to the number of which is equivalent to the number of VSYs. But the box just to the right, don't really pay attention to it. It's used to that old system. Remember we talked about the old system, the egg system, that percentage-based system. That's what that box to the right is trying to tell you about, and it's actually not relevant. The software is just what the software is, and you can't get rid of it at this time. So don't pay much attention to that box that you see to the right. After you allocate all of your VSYs, you'll get to this dashboard. It gives you some handy percentages that might be useful for you to know, and then you can click that Validate Performance Measures button down there to the bottom right. What's important about this is all it's validating is that you basically completed all of the fields that need to be completed. It's not checking your math. It's not checking to make sure that you have the right number or the right minimum number of VSYs in there. Not checking that the right number are programmed towards outcomes. All it's checking is that you filled out all of the fields. For all of that other stuff, you're going to need to check it yourself, and I really recommend having a conversation with your program officer before you even get to this stage. I think we all know e-grants can be a little bit finicky, and what you should really be doing is using another tool on our Managing Senior Core Grants page that I'm going to pull up in just a minute, called the Work Plan Development Worksheets, to think through all your options. When you do that, when you've got a pretty good idea of what you want to do, great time to have a conversation with your program officer. We do want to spotlight a couple of common pitfalls. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm going to talk about two that I think are particularly common. The first is that the service activity description is not complete. The service activity description is not complete. We've got, as I said, a number of specific questions that we're asking for about the service activity description, and you can find that in the grant application instruction. So take the time to fill that out completely. The other thing that we often find is that the community need and the intended outcome are not closely related. The logical chain between them doesn't quite make sense to us. Make sure that an outside reader, someone who's not familiar with your program, can understand the connection between those two. Okay, the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to hop on to the Managing Senior Core Grants page, and I'm going to show you all some of the tools that we talked about earlier. But while I do that, I want to do another call for questions. It's going to take me just 1 minute to switch the screen up here. And while I do that, feel free to drop questions into that chat box as we come down into the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. You should see some changes on your screen while I Okay, we're here on the Managing Senior Core Grants page. The first tools that I mentioned are these really critical documents, the invitations to apply. You can see there's one for FGP and one for SCP. And that's where you can find the exact text of our performance measure requirements, along with just about everything else you need to know for your renewal application. Below that are the grant application instructions. Those are largely step-by-step instructions for how to navigate e-grants. And they have that really important information about the questions that we're asking in our work plans that I just mentioned. Below that, you'll see the work plan development worksheets. Those allow you to rough out how you'll be allocating your VSYs. E-grants isn't so great at experimentation because it's a little bit clunky. It can be hard to say, oh, well, let me try this. No, okay, let me try this. The worksheets, though, are just what they sound like. They're worksheets. They're easy to experiment with, easy for you to try out different combinations as you work through all the possibilities available to your programs. The National Performance Measure instructions, of course, are where we have the full menu of performance measures that are available to all of you and some information on how to use them. There's some other resources there, but these are the really critical ones. These are the really critical ones. In addition, if you want to go back to the recording to this webinar and the slides from this webinar, as I already mentioned, they'll be in a link that you should receive pretty soon. That'll also have access to the transcript of the webinar and even a brief session summary. So all of that is coming your way. Okay, let's do one more call for questions. We haven't gotten any questions for a while, so let's do another call for questions. And I'll be watching the chat box to see what questions we have. Does anyone have any questions? All right, if there are no other questions, our parting words of wisdom will be to talk to your CNCS program officer, really use them throughout this process. Use the tools on the Managing Senior Corps Grants page and explore some of the courses available to you in Litmus. In particular, for our Senior Companion programs, we did a whole webinar on one of our Tuesday talks about the national performance measures. I'm going to do one last call for questions. All right, I'm not seeing any, so we're going to go ahead and sign off here. There's going to be a one-question poll that pops up on your screen. Please do go ahead and fill that out. It really helps us to know what works, what we can improve on, so we can keep helping out all of you. Please do take the time for that one-question satisfaction poll. Thanks, everybody, for